Max Roach, you played a tribute to Sid Catlett, and he must have been something in your background, a deep influence of one kind or another, and you might describe Sidney and his impact on you.
Well, you know, Sidney was one of those men who kind of guided young drummers through, you know, he would tell us certain things about how to take care of ourselves, of course, about posture and things like that. You know, most of the times when you first start working, you want to do everything as best as you possibly can, and you don't think about little things about if you don't sit properly, then 10 or 15 years from there, you might have back problems. Well, little things like that, they tell you, among other things about, they had a wonderful way of teaching. You know, if you could play somebody else's licks better than they could, you never got credit for it. You know, they'd kind of look at you and say, well, you know, you have to remember that you can't join the throng until you write your own song. You know, and all these kind of things stay with you. But you know, Leigh, as much as he had done for me and a lot of us, the rest of us who came up during that period and watching men like Sid, whose character and everything else was so fine, but he died at a concert that I played in Chicago at the Civic Opera House. He had come backstage, and I remember this so well. We had all come from New York to do a concert there in Chicago. I think with us was Billie Holiday and all his friends, all his Hot Lips Page and folks like that. And we were the young contingent, Miles and the rest of us. But I remember him at the stage door, backstage, and other groups were on. And I went backstage and I was so surprised and so happy to see him that night. And he came in and I told the doorman who he was. And he came in, of course, and he had a chance to say hello to all of his old friends. And then when I went on stage and came back, he was on a stretcher and they were taking him out. That was Big Sid. But that piece that I opened up the show with was a piece called Mop Mop that was written by Coleman Hawkins and recorded by Louis Armstrong. And when Sidney was working with Louis, that was one of the solo pieces that Louis featured Sid on, was Mop Mop.
You know, Mop Mop brings to mind a session in, of all places, Duluth, Minnesota. Coleman Hawkins had returned from England. He was playing the Flame on London Road. And a young bass player came up from Minneapolis by the name of Oscar Pettiford.
Right.
We set up the studio all night long, and among the compositions we recorded that night, just for a reference, was a theme called Mop Mop.
Isn't that something? That's right, Oscar Pettiford's from here.
This is homeland for Oscar.
Well, do you know, he was one of the fine, still is, I believe, one of the greatest innovators on that instrument that ever has lived, Oscar Pettiford. And his family's from here, and the Pettiford Band.
The entire organization, and Ira is still alive and living in this
something
area.
Because that band that we had on 52nd Street, Leigh I'd leave like walking on air with Oscar, Dizzy, George Wallington, and then first Bud Johnson, and then Don Byas, and then Charlie Parker.
Well, you certainly have been exposed in many different ways, and it occurs to me that you really have changed the role of the drummer, but I was thinking that your role with Ellington, your role with Parker, your role with Dizzy was a different reference altogether. For example, what was your role with Duke Ellington? What did you feel it to be as the percussionist?
Well, Duke was a free spirit, and I never felt inhibited. You know, when we did that album, Mingus, and I had the good fortune to do the album with Duke Ellington, there were a lot of stories I could tell about that. The day we rehearsed and the subsequent recording date itself. But he would say things like, well, firstly, he was always the first guy in the studio. You know, as a drummer, you go to a recording session or rehearsal, you're always an hour ahead of time because you have to set your kit up. And then the rest of the musicians, is not an easy one. When I get to the studio for rehearsal or for the session, way ahead of time because we're all excited about doing this trio date with Duke Ellington, he would already be there, writing or working. And then to allay any kind of nervousness perhaps that Mingus or I might have, he'd always allude to himself with, you know, I'm the poor man's Bud Powell and things like that. You know, he was just the kind of, he would always put you at ease and make you, and give you as much confidence. He'd make you feel as though you were his peer, which is really something.
He was one of the great teachers of the world.
Right, exactly.
Without ever being that kind of a disciplinarian.
But you know, when you say, talk about my contribution to the instrument, actually people like Sid Catlett and Chick Webb and Joe Jones and Baby Dawes and Baby Lovett are still the great masters of that instrument. I mean, really, when I listen today to the things that they have done, you know, we've forgotten so much. I recall once that we played Dizzy and Charlie Parker and who was the pianist? Well, anyway, and myself, we did the first jazz telecast in New York. Leonard Feather was the host, and Sidney Bechet and Baby Dodds had a group opposite us. And this may have been recorded because I've heard some air checks of it. And they would play Hold That Tiger, and we would play Hold That Tiger. And we would play How High Is the Moon, and Sidney and them would play their version of How High Is the Moon. And just give you an idea what kind of imagination the drummers had in during that period. You know, Hold That Tiger has a drum break at the end of it. You know, dee-dee-dee-dee, 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 bump, and then you play, you know, blah, 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 blah. But when it got to my little break, I just played all over the place, you know, just all my, you know, you're young and you practice technique all day, and I just filled up that moment with everything I could throw on the drums. And Baby Dawes, when it came to him to play the break, he picked up the snare drum and blew on it and produced this growl like a tiger, you know, dee-dee-dee-dee, dee-dee-dee-dee, and I was, you know, the beauty of it and the imagination and just something. And so, you know, I just, I'm always hoping that I can be, you know, I can be, make some kind of contribution somewhere near what they've already given us, because they have laid it out there for us. You know, we're just out here making a living, most of us, off of what has already been put down.
But what magnificent development and what magnificent evolution you're contributing to the idea of pulse and rhythm and time. And Max, sitting out in the audience with all of the rest of these people, I can only say that certainly you've learned your dynamics and color from the pioneers, but I think they would sit in awe out there watching you at work. Thanks so much for talking.
Thank you, Leigh. It's a pleasure. Good seeing you.
Good seeing you, and for your teaching career and all those fortunate students that meet you at Amherst at the University of Massachusetts. My, I only wish I were starting all over again.
Oh, thank you. Thank you.
It's a pleasure talking with you and a privilege.
Thank you.